one of our favorite houses, one of the best houses in the world. This book takes B.B. from Indianola, Mississippi, actually Kilmichael, all the way around the world several times. He was played a lot of concerts, we think 15,000 over 60 years in 19 countries, and hundreds of countries. Grammy, all the accolades. It's all here in this book, including a lot of the blues and a lot of the problems, particularly the early years of B.B. They're so heart-wrenching, but he persevered, and it's all in this great book. You did a great job of writing it. Yes, please welcome to our show, y'all, Daniel Visé.
Thank you. I don't know when I last saw a crowd this large. That's amazing.
Yeah, it's kind of tough being on the book tour with the pandemic, but we're glad you're here.
Yeah, it's worked out so far.
Yeah. They're glad you're here. I mean, absolutely, you're bringing the house down. We mentioned quickly earlier before the show about B.B.'s early years, and I want to get to that. But first off, I think it's great to just go back and get the basic question: what was it about his guitar playing and the sound he got out of that guitar that made him so distinct and made him B.B. King?
Yeah, the way I like to put it is if you're a fan of Eric Clapton or Buddy Guy or even like Jimi Hendrix or Carlos Santana, I will give you those people in this book if you read it, because what I do is I connect the dots back, a lot of years back to B.B., because B.B. King started recording in 1949, at which time the guitar was a backbench instrument. There weren't bands with guitars all over. There were barely any. And what B.B. did, what Riley King did when he arrived in Memphis, is he took a very slender sort of lineage of solo guitar playing, because there were some people who'd done it. The great Lonnie Johnson back in the 20s, Charlie Christian in the late 30s, and then T-Bone Walker, who was B.B.'s really big influence in the war years and post-war years. They'd all played solos on the guitar, but what B.B. did, just to oversimplify a bit, is he imbued the sound of the solo guitar with the sound of a human voice. He added in to those other sounds some elements of his own, from Bob Wills, the pedal steel, the Hawaiian pedal steel, which is a sweet, almost crying sound, and some things that B.B. heard in his own head. And what came out was this unique sound. Any of the great guitar goddesses and gods will tell you that there's no one else that sounds quite like B.B., but that sound, which is basically an extension of B.B. King's own voice, right? He sings, and then he stops, and then Lucille sings, became the pervasive sound by the sort of Woodstock era, and all the way to the end of the century. There were other sounds. There was slide guitar, Elmore James and that, and there was like Chuck Berry style, which is kind of like rhythm as lead guitar. But B.B.'s sound was the one that nearly every pop band from the late 60s on had to have somebody playing that way, and that's B.B.'s sound.
Yeah, truly amazing. I was so struck by his early life, and his first date was on a tractor. It was where he worked, and on many of the plantations, you worked your way up to being a tractor driver, and it was kind of a lofty position. He was 17, I think. He took a young lady, 14, into town, into Indianola, on a tractor, and please tell them she saw some yellow fabric at the fabric store in the window and said, "Hold on a minute." And she ran in there. Then you see her face drop. She comes back out without the fabric, and what did our hero do? What did B.B. do?
Well, Riley King, as he was then known, he'd been busking on sidewalks in Indianola, and first he was playing gospel, which he loved and was his first passion, but then he sort of figured out that if he played the blues, people would actually drop coins into his guitar case or whatever it was he put there. And so he knew how to do that. And so he said, "Hold on a minute." And he set up right there on the corner and started playing. And after a short time, he had enough money, and he walked in there and bought this swatch of fabric for her.
That's how to make an impression, ladies and gentlemen. Plus, he had that tractor. I mean, he had her at tractor, right? Yeah, that's great stuff. And radio was very important to him. He started out playing gospel on the radio. He was a radio guy.
Yeah, really early on, he was smitten with gospel. There was a Reverend Archie Fair in Kilmichael, which I think is just south of the hill country, right? And he loved this man, wanted to be this man, wanted to be a preacher who played the guitar, because that's what the Reverend Archie Fair did. So he learned to play the acoustic guitar, and he learned to play gospel, and he had a succession of, I think, 2 different gospel combos. And the second one in Indianola, when B.B. was probably in his late teens, went on the radio, WGRM, I think it was, in Greenville. And so if you'd been listening to the radio in or around Greenville circa, around 1943 or something, you would have heard him. Very different stuff. BB did actually do a gospel album in the very early, 60s or late 50s, which he did for his auntie because she didn't like the blues. She thought it was sort of evil. But that was the path not taken. Yeah.
Yeah. And I also love all the quirky stuff about BB. Apparently he was quite a collector. And collect clocks. He collect those bobblehead things. He collected VCRs. And also loved that he had his secretary, when he had to go out on the road, he would get that week's TV guide and highlight everything he wanted her to record for him.
Soap operas especially.
And it was The Young and the Restless and cowboy movies.
He loved cowboy movies.
What do you think to collecting stuff? And when he died, they went in the warehouse or whatever and said, "Oh my goodness!" And you think that was just from being poor all those years?
Some people are pack rats, but Charlie Sawyer, who wrote the authorized B.B. King biography and published it in 1980, theorized that it was because of those privations that he had suffered in childhood that drove him to collect, office supplies and just ephemera, and he did it his whole life, and not to mention the records, many, many, many records, which now reside in this town, I believe.
Absolutely right. Greg Johnson is the curator of the archive over there, and he has, I think, 20,000 albums, vinyl records that BB donated to the University of Mississippi, and I actually had a chance to go through there and tour those records. It's really strange what he had, like all the James Bond soundtracks. It was just stuff you wouldn't necessarily think he would have.
He had Catholic tastes with a small c. He was into all kinds of music, just like one of the jazz masters,
All right, are you going to read just a bit from this great book?
I will, and this book that I hold in my hands, I'm going to donate it to WYXM. Is that the right call letters? The public radio station in Memphis?
WYXR.
WYXR, pardon me, WYXR. They're doing, I think, their first pledge drive, and this very book is going to be donated to that cause.
Well, bless your heart.
Well, it'll be kind of sweaty by that time. But
Daniel Visé, y'all.
Back inside a jail was one place B.B. King thought he would never go. He had spent only a single night in a cell after a white cop flagged him down on a Mississippi highway for doing 80 in a 60-mile-per-hour zone. That was in 1950. B.B. was then a struggling musician and underpaid radio performer in his 20s, still picking cotton to make ends meet, racing to a gig in a borrowed car. The fine was $90. B.B. didn't have it, and the imperious cop knew it. 2 decades later, on September 10, 1970, B.B. stood on the cusp of his 45th birthday. In those 45 years, Riley B. King had risen from penniless sharecropper to sidewalk busker to Memphis DJ to chart-topping singer to king of the blues. Guitar heroics defined popular music in 1970, and B.B. King was the first guitar hero. B.B.'s story was the story of the Great Migration, the northward journey that delivered millions of African Americans from southern plantations into the urban north. B.B. had hitchhiked out of Mississippi, found fame in Memphis, and then set out across the nation in a bus called Big Red. After 2 decades on the fabled black Chitlin circuit, B.B. had crossed over, capping his symbolic breakthrough with a triumphant performance for a throng of white hippies at San Francisco's pot-scented Fillmore Auditorium in 1967. Can I say that on the radio? Pot-scented? After that, B.B.'s audience had changed color. He played mostly for whites now. But this gig was different. A show inside Chicago's infamous Cook County Jail, conceived by an African-American warden to entertain 2,400 inmates, most of them African-Americans. B.B. rejoiced at performing for black people again. B.B. and his band entered the jail around 11 that morning. Stony-faced guards patted them down and escorted them through heavy steel doors, which closed with a sickening clang. The group proceeded down endless windowless tunnels, past offices and cells in the jail's electric chair to a mess hall, followed everywhere by eyes empty of everything except deep, numbing pain, one musician recalled. B.B. chatted with the inmates, trying to push down the primal terror of being locked inside a prison, a place that felt final and scary and rock hard. A beefy guard shadowed the blues man, his eyes searching for the flashing blade of a shank. Most of the men were young enough to be B.B.'s children. One by one, they shared stories of languishing inside cells for months without end, awaiting trial, unable to post bail, powerless to leave. After a tasteless meal, guards led the band outside to a bleak and gusty courtyard. The entourage headed toward a small stage, a raised platform where condemned men had once been hanged. A stubborn wind tore sheet music from the musicians' stands and whisked it over the forbidding 30-foot stone walls. But a warm autumn sun shone on the yard, and the air was a perfect 70 degrees. The weather had held, and that was good, for organizers had committed to a concert on this day. Bibi was playing for free, but his label had spent $10,000 on transportation, salaries, and equipment to record the performance for eventual release as a live album. The musicians warmed up, played a sound check, and jammed with men from the jailhouse band as the audience filed out to the yard. 200 female inmates sat in folding chairs at stage left. More than 2,000 men sprawled out in roped-off sections of grass. The men on death row remained locked in their cells, listening through opened windows. The concert began at 1. "Hello out there," a female jail official announced. She introduced the white sheriff and a prominent white judge to the jump-suited crowd, setting off a chorus of violent boos that echoed across the yard. 50 guards with thick batons and 50-caliber semi-automatic rifles roamed the perimeter and perched atop towers. Concerts didn't get much more real. Sensing tension in the air, the announcer hurried things along, beckoning, "Would you please come forth, Mr. King?" And then Bibi climbed atop the old gallows, clad in an olive-green plaid suit. A gunshot blast from Sonny Freeman's snare drum announced the first song, "Every Day I Have the Blues." The six-piece band raced forward, shuffling in matching powder blue suits, propelled by Freeman's galloping swing beat. Bibi spun the volume knob to awaken Lucille, his sinuous, symmetrical Gibson guitar. He played his first notes, climbing up to a blue third, bending the string with his powerful fingers to rise from D flat to D natural, then dancing back down and ending the solo phrase on a sustained note. Bibi flailed his left wrist up and down to create the shimmering vibrato that was his trademark. Bibi felt that he and Lucille spoke with the same voice, one picking up where the other left off. A few bars later, it was Bibi's turn. Every day I have the blues," he sang, a rich, booming baritone that formed way back in his clenched throat. 2 minutes later, the song was over, and the yard erupted in applause and cheers. This audience surely could relate to the blues. Now the band slid into Bibi's signature song, "How Blue Can You Get?" Lucille unleashed an aural fireworks display that recounted the history of urban blues, much of it written by Bibi on his guitar. Soaring bends, rapid-fire staccato bursts, and sustained tremulous tones. And then Bibi sang, "I've been downhearted, baby, ever since the day we met," he growled, reminding his audience that he was not just the world's greatest blues guitarist, but also an archetypal rhythm and blues singer. Bibi sang and Lucille cried, and the crowd talked and cried and shouted back. As Bibi slowed into a campy feminine reading of the song's climactic bridge, the audience clamor threatened to overwhelm the band, a release of pure electric energy that Bibi breathed in like oxygen. Much as Bibi's new white fans adored him, they did not know how to engage, how to participate in a B.B. King show, any more than they would have known what to do in an African-American church. But here at the jail, as the band proceeded into an obscure 1950s single titled "Worry, Worry, Worry," Bibi called out to the audience, and the audience responded, singly and collectively. "Throw your arms around him," he cried, and the crowd shouted back, "Yeah!" "Hold him close to you, yeah!" "Look him straight in the eye, yeah!" The song ended. Now Bibi reached back almost 20 years to sing and play his first big hits, 3 O'Clock Blues and You Know I Love You, songs he mostly saved for black audiences. He knew that many in this crowd had heard them the first time around. This was B.B. King, blues crooner. "Don't forget Sweet 16, someone cried. "All right, baby," Bibi cooed. He played that one next. Some of the loudest cheers came from scattered male inmates wearing dresses and wigs. At first, the band mistook them for women. The concert climaxed with a slow-burning take on "The Thrill Is Gone," the song that had secured Bibi a future in the pop music pantheon of white America. "I'm free, free, free now, baby," Bibi roared. The men in the grass and the women in the chairs, not free, roared back. Looking out across the sea of black faces made me sad and glad, Bibi recalled. Sad that so many brothers were behind bars. Glad that I was reaching out to my own people. Such moments reminded Bibi of the miles he had traveled and of the sun-bleached sharecropper cabin where his journey had begun.
Daniel Visé, y'all. Great job. King of the Blues, The Rise and Reign of B.B. King. Daniel will join us after the show, sign copies of this great book. So much fun. Remember when we had B.B.'s guitar on our license plate for Mississippi? We had Lucille. Maybe we can bring Lucille back. Those were good days when Lucille was on the tag, as we say. Great job, Daniel. Thank you so much. All righty, John Paul Keith, y'all. How about this?